Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third event in our series. This is entitled Legislating the Metaverse. With me, I have Patrick Lynn and Hillary Brill. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But if you aren't aware of what the Foundry is, it's basically a nonprofit organization for young career, early career professionals and young students who are interested in everything tech, law, and policy. We, as a few, I guess, not disclaimers, but a few things to note. We do have a writing competition on the Metaverse that is open until the 13th of October, where you can win prizes. And we do have a hackathon, and I will share that information shortly. But one thing to note about myself is that I am a nonpartisan legislative attorney. And so one aspect of today's session is going to be a drafting on the fly session. I cannot promise it will be my best work ever because it's in 45 minutes, but it will definitely be a conversation starter for other people. And while I get my links together, I will let Patrick or Hillary introduce themselves briefly. Whoever wants to go first.
Hillary, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Donalene. Donalene, it is so wonderful to get an opportunity to work with you again and to see you working in such an interesting capacity. And you would definitely have skills that are very useful that many people don't realize are not easy. It's not always easy to do. Again, I'm Hillary Brill. Thank you for having me here. I am actually have been an advisor and continue to be an advisor to the Foundry. I'm very impressed by all the work that all of you do. Particularly this year, it's been an extraordinary year of events and activities revolved around the hackathon. All of you have been impressive, and I'm looking forward to the future events that you're going to be having this week. What I am currently here in an official capacity, I am a senior fellow at the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy at Georgetown, where I also teach technology, policy, and the law, where we discuss issues just like the ones we're discussing today. In fact, I was so excited, I actually brought this issue up to my class to help them understand how difficult or easy it can be to draft something. And there were lots of aha moments because lawyers in general don't think about the drafting process, particularly law students. They think more about reading case law after something has actually been passed and it has gone to courts, and then they read it in a book. So that's usually 15 years later, or lucky 5 years later. I am a lawyer by training. I just like you, I'm also Georgetown Law, graduate, happy to represent there. I have worked in technology policy and the law in a variety of different legislative capacities, communications capacity, government relations capacities, in law firms, the private sector, and public sector. And currently, I feel very fortunate to get to teach and consult for both nonprofit and for-profit companies. So this is a great opportunity. I get to always stay involved in the cutting edge issues, and clearly the metaverse is the issue that so many people are talking about. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Hillary. Patrick.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Kalin. I'm really excited to be here and just really looking forward to hearing more about what Hillary and Donalene both think about the metaverse and sort of, I think the panel format is super interesting. I've certainly never been on a panel that's formatted quite this way, and so really interested in sort of seeing how that unfolds. But just a little bit about myself. I don't believe I can call myself a lawyer just yet. I had just graduated from Brooklyn Law School back in May, took the bar in July, and will be actually starting work at Latham & Watkins next week. But aside from that, during law school, I also wrote a book called Machine See, Machine Do, which sort of goes into algorithmic bias and how tech solutionism, especially when it's applied to a lot of government functions like law enforcement and the justice system, sometimes don't quite lead to the results that we're looking for, especially fair and objective ones. And so a lot of my research focus and interest is really focused on AI, surveillance, algorithmic bias, and data privacy in particular. And I think all of those topics really intersect when we're talking about the metaverse as well. And so that's where I've been really interested in looking more into sort of those user interactions, protecting user data privacy, things like that. And so, yeah, just really looking forward to discussing all of those things today.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. So we are going to move into the panel portion of this, where it will be question and answer, but I will also be drafting. I am going to share my screen and maybe share the Google Doc. I don't know, we'll decide. But one thing about my role in this is that I'm typically the devil's advocate when drafting. And so I will be asking questions to try and tease things out. And it may seem like I have an opinion. I don't. I'm just going opposite. But I think I might be neutral because we might have a pro and an anti, well, a critical of the metaverse perspective. So this will be interesting. Here, let me share my screen. Share screen, and we will be sharing this one. Yes. Okay, I think everyone can see that. So I think the first question, right, we just have to dive in is, how would you define the metaverse? Or like, what considerations should one take when defining the metaverse?
Okay, I love this question, and I love that you're doing this legislative activity, because if we don't define what seems kind of obvious in some ways, then how do we know how to actually create any kind of rules around it? And I apologize because, again, I told you I teach a lot of legislative policies. So the way I always think of it is every bill should be addressing a problem and have a solution. And if you're going to define the problem, we have to define what the metaverse is. And Patrick, I just jumped in. I hope, please feel free to interject at any time. But I think it's worth mentioning that the metaverse can mean so many different things to so many people. And I know it's a fancy word to throw out, but just the term metaverse is a portmanteau with the word meta and then verse, and meta being outside of our universe. So it can be anything as giant as that, as outside of our universe, to something very finite and specific. And when you decide how finite and specific that's going to be, that's when you really start to dig into who is going to be affected by this bill. And if it's too narrow, then you could be targeting just specific companies, for example, that might have a term meta, and that isn't necessarily the way to go. And if it's too broad, you could be scooping in so many different types of technologies that shouldn't necessarily have these regulations. So I know that's not your answer, but I always like to sort of set up the fact that this is not an easy question. And researching, in my own mind, what I think of as a metaverse, or anyone who does a quick, search on what they think the metaverse is, that term has been around for quite a while. It is not Facebook's, frankly, horizon. Most people think Facebook has the metaverse and owns the metaverse. It is not Facebook's horizon world, in my mind. Now, Patrick might have a different concept of it. And in my mind, it has different factors, different ingredients in it. And it has to be a digital environment. It has to be a virtual environment. And then you start to really get into, does it have to have a hardware component? Does it have to have an AR, an augmented reality or a virtual reality component? And if it does, then do we still consider what some people call XR? Like, how far do we go? Does it have to have a software and a hardware component? And just to throw another wrinkle into this conversation, there could be other ways in the future and other types of technologies that can allow individuals to connect to some kind of virtual world that isn't exactly the hardware that we're envisioning now. So the way we define this is really tricky, is how I'd like to say it. This is very, very tricky. And I think for those watching this and haven't done some kind of legislative drafting experience, defining terms and defining the problem can be overwhelming or the trickiest part. I just want to say one side anecdote. I remember crossing the paths of someone on my way to lunch that remembered I was working on technology policy and said, so much is going on with content moderation right now. And that was when there was quite a bit going on about Section 230 in the news. And that meant that most people who don't even follow this were actually watching what was happening. It was after Trump had been deplatformed off of Twitter. And he just literally stopped me and said, all this is happening, all that's happening. And I said, I know, it's really, a complicated issue. And he said, so what are we going to do about it? And that's always the issue. Like it's generally these panels are a conversation of what's the problem, but like, what are you going to do? And I go, gosh, if I knew that, exactly what to do, that's the what we used to say, the $64,000 question. That's the huge question. So I don't know if I gave you enough ingredients to pull us back to what the metaverse is, but I think that's a good starting point, at least to pass the baton to Patrick, who might have something already drafted and written or etched in stone. So Patrick, go ahead.
That's very generous. I definitely don't have anything drafted quite yet, but I do think that I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Hillary. I think especially with respect to sort of how this definition, it's a tricky exercise, I think, because I think it's something that will continue to evolve. And I think there is a concern about it being too broad or too narrow. Are we regulating more than we necessarily plan to or need to? Or are we, not accounting for what that metaverse, quote unquote metaverse experience will include? But I think when I think about the metaverse and defining it, I think I tend to think about characteristics or features of what that metaverse looks like. And I think what you've included here, like virtual, I think that's definitely a big piece of it. I also think of things like persistent. I think of social, and I think of interaction as other features of what a metaverse looks like. I think how it's been marketed is it's sort of this, virtual cyberspace that exists even when we're not there, when we're not plugged into it, when we're not logged in, it still exists, much like how, our actual sort of IRL life is, right? Our world here, it continues to function, operate, and events will unfold whether we're there or not. And then I think the interaction piece is really important because there's interactions that take place within that quote unquote metaverse and without as well. And so I think that's also about whether it's, I have a hard time saying the metaverse because I think it'll be multiple metaverses right now. I think based on how tech companies really sort of engage in competition and things like that, I think there's a goal to make sort of this unified, standardized, singular metaverse. And I don't know if that'll necessarily be what the final product will look like. I think it'll be a bunch of different metaverses. And whether, companies like Meta, Microsoft, and so on and so forth, whether they're willing to let each other's metaverses talk to each other and whether people will be able to freely move between them, I think that's another piece of it. And so I think deciding on whether it is a metaverse or the metaverse, I think is another piece of it that I think will be really difficult to determine right now. But I think if there is a legislative proposal, if there is a plan to regulate, I think that's part of it because how metaverses communicate to each other too is something that we'll have to account for.
I want to say one thing to follow up on what Patrick said. I think it's worth just a little bit more time talking about the fact that I agree that it's not the metaverse, that most people go to a movie called Ready Player One and they think you put on this whole suit and you can feel what's going on and you put on all this technology and you go in and you have this pretty much this one company that runs the entire metaverse that has all these social interactions, and that isn't necessarily what the landscape is going to look like, and that's definitely not what the landscape is right now. And I think it's worth, and Patrick, please help me out here, like examples that exist today so people that are watching kind of understand what we're talking about. I mean, there are examples that people call a metaverse, from whether it's Roblox, which is, again, a virtual world, but you don't necessarily have to wear, an AR or VR mask. People consider a lot of gaming, right? Like Minecraft or Fortnite as a metaverse. There are virtual worlds where you can buy virtual land, like Decentraland, and people consider that a metaverse. And I loved your discussion about it's happening when you're not there, because that is the idea. Like you can buy land and people can go to your property and, whether it's locked or not, but the idea that it is a alternate, universe that's already existing. Second Life, some people consider that a metaverse, and that's been going on since, the early aughts. And that was the idea of a virtual environment. When you think of what Meta is putting together in the Horizon world, that generally includes, a mask, and the concept of actually going into it. And already there are different companies creating, and you could consider this a metaverse, virtual environments where they're training people in different ways. And if those start to be social interacted, is that also a metaverse? So I love that you said, don't call it the metaverse. It may turn into the metaverse. It may be the hundreds turn into a few and then one, but we just don't know.
Okay, you guys gave a lot.
Good job taking notes.
But I think one thing that was consistent was this idea that it's a virtual reality space in which consumers can interact with a computer-generated environment and other users. I think that was at minimum what you both agreed upon. And I think with respect to the other aspects, that we can only address when we figure out what is the use or the problem that we are trying to solve. And so for anyone who is looking at this and is thinking about how they would go about defining the metaverse, I think at minimum, you'd have to think about whether you want to define it in terms of the user experience or whether you want to define it in terms of the physical, technical components of the metaverse. The only thing about that, as Hillary and Patrick alluded to, it's more of, you might not be able to future-proof that, right? Like the technical capabilities that we have today, who knows what that's going to look like in the future? And then you are stuck now to this particular thing. I think a good example, granted, we are still stretching it, but there's like a Video Online Privacy Act, right? Like we don't really use like DVRs and like those types of technologies anymore, but like we're still stretching it, Okay, so what problem or solution we'd want to solve? I would just take a second here for those who are not as familiar with the metaverse and say the metaverse has multiple use cases, right? Like people are using it in the classroom. There are lots of metaversities happening right now. You can use it for therapy. You can use it for museums. You can use it. I think South Korea is doing this like trial run with their government. And so you can do town halls and get requests from from governmental officials. Med schools are using it. I think I saw an article about like in war zones where they're using it to show what the world would have looked like if this place had not been bombed. Like there's so many use cases, and depending on what use you want, there are different problems. And so who wants to go first? What problem do you want to solve?
God, what problem do I want to solve? Wow, there's so many. I also want to clarify. I mean, you're talking about it's being used. And again, we still haven't really defined metaverse. And if you take the term that Patrick just mentioned about it's always there, I think some of those examples are probably always there, right? Like if you're using trainings, they're not necessarily like a world going on without you. So it's right? Like it's just the definitions. I'm not saying what you said was wrong.
That's true.
In any way. I was just saying it's so complicated. And I love the fact that this just brings to light, basically what can happen when any member of Congress just comes in and tries to say, we need to do something about that metaverse. And it's just not that simple. And and you talked about, future proofing. Every bills can either be reactive or proactive, right? And sometimes both. And I envision if there really will be a specific metaverse bill, it will probably be reactive to something specific, because that usually is what generates Congress to like do something. The minute the metaverse is something really bad, it's going to happen. I think that generally what we're doing is a wonderful proactive concept and conversation. So problems, I think that Patrick wrote like a whole book probably that I think, right? Like on the problems of it. So why don't you get started, and I'll just add in, some of my thoughts.
Sure. I think when I think about the metaverse, and this is not exhaustive or all encompassing or anything like that, but I think the three sort of broad buckets I think about in terms of like real world problems that need to be addressed in the metaverse are first commerce / like transactions, which I think also brings in things like ownership, regulating, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, things like that. That's one piece of it. And then the second would be things like data privacy and protection. I think when I think about the metaverse right now, I think about how the plan is to be able to access it using virtual reality headsets, and what kind of information can be gathered through that, right? Things like, whether your eyes will dilate when there's a certain, promotion for a product, or what your facial expressions are when you're interacting with friends in that space, what that might look like, and how it's monitored and how long it's being stored for. And then the final piece I think about is user interaction. Things like, we've already, with social media and with a lot of like online platforms, seen how, sometimes people say really vile things to each other and do really awful things using the internet, whether it's, doxing, posting very personal, intimate information about people, and sexual harassment as well. We've already seen cases, recorded cases of sexual harassment in the metaverse. And how do we address that? Are there, are the laws in the real world, are those applying to interactions there? And how do we provide, remedies for people who experience things that would otherwise have, some sort of punishment or some sort of way for them to get a remedy in the real world? Would that still apply in that virtual space? And so I'll start there as those sort of three buckets, commerce, data privacy, user interaction, and maybe we can go from there or expand, Hillary, but that's sort of what I'm thinking right now.
I don't think it's a shock that I'm sitting here going check. And we haven't talked about this before, so this is great that I get to hear, immediately the key issues that are happening in technology today fall into all those buckets, and those issues haven't been. I mean, they're in a different format, or they're nuanced, or they might have a little bit of a different angle, but these are issues that have plagued our internet usage for over 20 years, all of them. And that is why it's so easy to just tick them off and tell you what the top key issues would be in the metaverse, because they're the top key issues that we've been talking about forever. And more recently, because people are frustrated with certain entities having greater control, and users realizing what powers and powerlessness they actually have. I had here commerce. I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's not always one that people first go to, so that brings me great joy, specifically as someone who has an extensive background in e-commerce. These issues have been going on, as I just said, since the beginning of e-commerce, and issues that are offline are not changing with the metaverse. The metaverse is just the next iteration of the internet that we're using today, whether it's going to have blockchain technology, which we obviously can go into and discuss, but that's how most people are thinking of it, particularly with commerce. That's why I saw you throw in NFTs, which might make people's eyes glaze over. But the idea of commerce in the metaverse and in gaming and with entertainment, the reason why there's so much investment and excitement by industry is because this is an opportunity with new technology, which is basically blockchain technologies, to sell digital assets, to sell digital. So I'm not talking about cryptocurrency. I'm not talking about tokens. I'm talking about my my avatar can wear a gold sparkly dress or a pink sparkly dress. I can actually use technology to say that is the one and only. And if I sell it to you, Patrick, it's one and done. I don't get it back, and you can wear it. In the metaverse, in our fake world. So that's that's a big reason why you have so many brands that are so excited about the concept of metaverse. It's already happening. Entertainment, you can sell a song, and the idea of that's been going around in copyright law with can you resell a song? Well, if it's digitized and it's on blockchain, well, then we know if I have it anymore, or if Patrick has it, or if you have it, Donalene. So these issues have been going on. It's just technology is at that next generation. And I think this commerce is clearly the driving force behind whatever iteration of the internet we're going to have, and behind all the investment and reason why it's getting so much play. But I do want to say one thing: whatever is happening in the offline world in commerce, or happening in our current web iteration, which some people call 2.0, those problems are going to be there. And I'm talking about fraud. Am I going to be selling you a fake digital asset? Am I going to be selling you something in a metaverse, and then it's in the offline world and it's fake? So we're going to have counterfeit issues. We're going to have fraud issues. We're going to have health and safety issues. Am I selling you something that isn't safe? And that might be defined differently in a virtual world. But then when you take it, if we're going into a commerce world and then we buy stuff offline, those issues are not absolutely not going away. And I think you mentioned ownership, and I love that you said that, because it is all about ownership. And the new technologies have created different concepts of ownership. I like to think, I buy something, I own it. And this whole idea of whether something's licensed or whether it's a digital asset, it just creates all these new concepts of what we own. So thank you so much for putting commerce right up there. Now, should we regulate that in this bill, Donalene? I'm not sure, even though I just put a lot of airtime on it. I'm not sure. The other issue, clearly, privacy, privacy, privacy. This is where I think it's so easy to understand the frightening / scary / horror stories that can be thrown around and bandied around appropriately with what could happen with the metaverse. We're already seeing that our information can be taken from us without our knowledge, or even really tech savvy people. It's being used in ways we don't want it to, or didn't know. The types of information that is going to be gathered in the metaverse is going to be different and arguably worse. I don't know, you could have a discussion about that. But once you have these new types of hardware that we haven't even imagined, and even existing hardware, different types of information about biometrics in my body and the way physiological traits. How quick do my eyes move when something shiny is in front of me? Does my heart beat, or am I calm in a bad situation? Where is that information going? How is that being tracked? Who's using it? What about what might be actually recorded in my room? Where is that going? So more personal information is being, I guess that is in data collection, it's kind of tied, is being collected. How is that being used? All the questions that we're asking now appropriately and cannot seem to get a federal bill on. So I don't know how we would really, do this in a metaverse, but those issues are increased in concern, I think, with the metaverse. I guess the data privacy is, you have to make sure that whatever is being collected is being protected appropriately. And I think that goes into issues of security, who gets access to this, not just the companies, but how is it being protected and where is it being protected? And your user interaction, I call it content moderation, because that's, the buzzword that's going around. How do we regulate things that we don't want on the internet? And then who we are is defined differently, and what we don't want is defined differently. And it's the same thing in the metaverse. What language is appropriate to be discussed? What kind of activities are appropriate? And I think major companies are going through this in a different way, and perhaps even in a better way than some other metaverses that might be defining themselves differently. If you're Meta and you're Horizon, you might be a lot more concerned because people might expect a safer space frankly, in a Horizon world because you're a big company. So will they allow the sale of virtual guns? Will they allow the sale of virtual drugs? What is actually going to be allowed? And then, as you said, the way that people interact, the same problems in the internet with cyberbullying and harassment can be more physical in a meta way. And there already are the questions that are bandied around, like, can you be sexually harassed in the metaverse? Like, what does that mean? And what do you do about it? So I loved your categories. I think they're spot on. I think that the only thing I want to add, which I thought you would add, particularly with your whole background in AI, is we need to be careful about bias in the design of future technologies, whether they're used in the metaverse or not. We now know that there is, biases that we can't get rid of, biases that we can try, but whoever is designing these next generation of products, please make sure that there's an understanding of that, and to the extent that it's possible to make it less biased. And there's this inherent bias with the fact that the people who are that are creating the metaverse and the people that have created whatever metaverse we're working in, I think they're all like, basically the majority are like 30 and under. Like, I'm a dinosaur and I'm interested in it. So think about, and the demographic, who is designing this stuff right now, and they're going to design it and target it towards their interests and needs. So we need to really think that through. So in terms of legislation, what does that mean? I think that's where a study might happen. I think that's where you might want to throw in some, if you really want a regulatory agency involved, because I know that's one of your future questions. I'm not sold on that, but that's where I think some of these issues of how do we sort of proactively and consider these types of civil liberties and considerations that we didn't do 20 years ago when we were trying to foster the innovation of the internet. We can look at this now and really think about it and put it forward.
Okay.
I know I talked a long time. You have to take notes, lots of notes.
No, we are doing well. I think that at the outset, one big thing would be essentially figuring out what standards a metaverse should meet. And I think from hearing both of you, it's more of privacy by design, and also factoring in different perspectives so that we are ensuring that this world looks like and is for every single person who could be using it, making sure it's accessible, making sure that it is created by diverse individuals. And by doing that, you would hopefully get at the user interaction and also the bias aspect, because if you're creating this world in such a way that you have, I guess, control mechanisms for the user to reject someone else's advances. And so I think I heard that, and I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but there's a particular metaverse platform, let's say, that allows for users to garble everyone around you. So you can't really hear them talking to you, but then you can choose whether you want to listen to them or not. Like, you can choose whether you want to interact with the person. And so you can have actual software aspects, or you can have like a user code of conduct that no one actually reads, but they say they're going to abide by it, and then you kick them off after, like, I don't know, a couple of, I guess, assessments or like screenings. And so I think that is a fair start. One question that I had for both of you was essentially, of these 4 buckets, so commerce, data privacy protection, data collection, and user interaction, which do you think is already solved by the current legal frame? I know this is like a really big, I know it's a really big question. or which you think is exacerbated by the metaverse, and that like we definitely need to have something that is tailored to the metaverse, or is it more so that other legal frames may just have to have like a subtle thing to modify it slightly, and that could probably just be through case law or an enforcement agency. And so I'm thinking, at least with commerce, it's probably better for that to be a regulatory agency, because they already have a legal framework, right? No, Hillary is
I'm sorry, you'll have to, that, you had me until commerce and regulatory agency. So you had me at what area has already been corrected, for lack of a better term, by current, or is being regulated by existing law.
Yes,
What
we can leave it there.
which I think the short answer, I don't think any of them are clearly regulated, and that's why I'm so busy in the tech policy law space, and it's fun. I think it's frankly only worse. So when you ask this follow-up question of which area is even worse, I think all of us hadn't really thought of how, or I shouldn't say all of us, I haven't thought through all the different iterations of what the metaverse could do and its implications in all these different areas. Many people are, many people smarter than me, many people who are using the internet, metaverse more than me. They probably have lots of ideas and thoughts as well in terms of how existing laws aren't working. So that's a short answer to say, I don't think anything has been fixed. And I think all of these issues need to be looked at. If I had to categorize them,
Yeah,
I don't want to, but if I had to, don't like that. It's so interesting. I kind of want to go to the user interaction, but that's not true, because we're having so many problems with the Section 230, which is the catchphrase of who should be liable for when things happen on the internet. So I want to say, like, should the metaverse be liable if something bad, I do something bad to Patrick in the metaverse, or should it be me who's liable? Like, those issues are still not clear in the real world, because there's a lot of issues about, should Twitter be liable if something bad happens because of an interaction of Twitter? Section 230 was created to protect platform liability in certain situations. Should it extend to the metaverse? I think, wow, you'll have a lot of people who say no. You'll have a lot of people who say, let's really be careful how we think about it. So I thought that one, and then I'm like, oh, not sure. And then I agree with you on commerce. A lot has been well defined about like what is counterfeit. However, the NFTs has concept, and the whole concept of blockchain and buy digital assets, and the whole idea that we don't really own anything in the metaverse because it's all virtual, or what does ownership mean, is confusing, mind-blowing to many, and it's making us reevaluate whether or not existing rules actually make sense there. I think, to take a step back, I would at least think exactly what you said. Let's make sure that whatever we're doing in the outside of the metaverse world that works stays and isn't misplaced by anything you put in this bill.
Yeah, that works. Someone wrote in the Q&A a good point about identity fraud, which is another aspect.
100%. And to say fraud, like who you are. And then that, and I think that was Melanie. I can see it on the questions. Valerie, great point. And I think that's a perfect example where fraud is fraud is fraud. So if that's something that's happening, it's an identity theft. It would be great to review identity theft laws and see if that makes perfect sense as well in the metaverse. Is it, right? Like, does that actually count in the metaverse? What, is identity a metaverse identity? It possibly could be, but it might not. So I think that's a great point. Also, I saw in the question and answer, someone had put, Donalene, some ideas and thoughts for defining the metaverse, just so you can see. And what I like about this is more real world. Like, you would go to different stakeholders and you would talk to so many different people to get their versions and ideas. It wouldn't be just maybe in our ideal world, Patrick, we could just sit and write whatever we want to do. But in like, and Donalene will write it down. But in the real world, I mean, right, it's just a plethora. I mean, an abundance of people that are coming in and giving their thoughts. And that's our policymakers' job, right? To hear everybody's thoughts and then say, well, this is what we're doing. Which I don't always envy.
Okay, I think it's better to start out with saying each virtual reality space shall, and then we're gonna do very basic, meet the following characteristics or requirements. And so we're not actually tying it to a platform or an actual entity. We're saying like, if there is a space, a metaverse, it will do X, Y, and Z. It has to meet the following things. I guess I should be consistent with my thing and say each metaverse. And so we want that I'm just writing plainly and then we'll clean it up. But for it to be designed by a diverse group of professionals, right? We want that it is designed with privacy in mind, but then you'd have to like actually define that, like what would that look like? So that would be another section. I think another way to go about this is also just say like, what would each consumer, what experience each consumer should have in the metaverse. And so this can get at the ability to correct their data in instances where inferences were made. And so that would mean that they would need to see the data, right, in order to then be able to correct it. Whether they can correct it downstream. And so for second and third party individuals, that's a whole nother can of worms. But each consumer shall have the following rights. And so the ability to correct inferences made with respect to their biometric information. Actually, no, we're not even going to tie it to biometric information. We're just going to tie it to anything in their file, because that's probably easier. Who knows what else is going to be in their file? The ability to correct with respect to their I'm just gonna say user identity and leave it at that. The ability to I want to say like be free from harassment, but like that will always be broken, right? Like unless you design the software in such a way that no one can actually harass anyone, that's always going to be broken, and therefore the company will always be liable. And that's just like no company is going to then create a metaverse if that's an actual requirement. And so then how would you go about making this a reasonable thing? Oh, there's another question. Ooh, hackers and psychological harm.
I'm sort of this is just me thinking aloud here, but what if we were to tie that to a matter of user choice when it comes to like types of activities or engaging with, or be able to choose or even limit the type of interactions that they can or want to have. I'm not sure if maybe that's the way to go about it. That's just my immediate thought right now.
No, I think that works, because if you are confronted with harassment, but you have the ability to quickly exit, to quickly block this individual or mute this individual or put physical distance in between you and this individual, I think that works, right? Like it gives the company the ability to like safeguard themselves from liability, and the user is empowered. Everyone loves to be empowered. Ooh, safe zones. There's a great question here about enforcement in terms of who would be liable. And I think that really depends, right? And so if one of the requirements or duties is that this is designed by a diverse group of professionals, whoever is responsible for like curating these individuals, they would be the one who would be responsible. If it's designed with the privacy in mind, the company could pivot that responsibility or liability to the professionals themselves, and so they would be the responsible ones. Same thing with like security. I did not anticipate we'd have that many questions. And so yeah.
I'm sending an answer to one of them, if that's all right.
Okay, great. Yes.
Yeah. What I enjoyed about the questions, without answering each and every one of them, is that immediately, the minute you put anything down on paper, there are,
yes,
in my mind, 1,000 questions. I have tons of questions.
Yes.
I could, it's so easy to rip something apart than create something. And it's not ripping you apart, but
oh yeah, go ahead.
I love the interaction that's happening on the Q&A or in the chat. And thank you is basically what I'm saying to the group of people that have joined, because you're highlighting issues of definitions and how different people have different perspectives. And if we don't take those into consideration, it's a different bill. Each person's looking at it differently.
But I think that's very crucial, right? Because not every single, like, say this were to be something introduced by a member of Congress, right? Like, not every person wants to tackle the same issues.
Yeah.
And so, like, we are essentially trying to sketch out everything, right? Whereas, like, someone might think, oh, it's not actually feasible for me to do, like, the responsibilities of the online platform and still the users and still like all of these different aspects. It's probably better for me to just think about commerce. It's probably better for me to just think about like data privacy. And it's frankly easier to just do a privacy bill or like a user bill of rights with respect to the metaverse than to carve out this entire thing.
Yeah, there are just so many different and competing, I think, priorities here. Everyone sort of has their own vision of, what's important in that space.
Yes. Ooh, cybersecurity. I honestly think, I feel like cybersecurity is going to just, the existing cybersecurity frameworks, that is going to prevail as opposed to something that's specific for the metaverse. but I think one thing that can latch on to the metaverse is the fact that you have like the physical hardware and also the software. So you have like two layers to then think about security for users, and not, I think for other aspects, it's just either this, the software or like the hardware, and not many things have both components. And I think here both components are going to be really important, especially with respect to the sensitivity of the data and like biometric information and the inferences that you can make in terms of, I am in my room and you know how my kitchen is laid out, or you know like the distance from my apartment to my neighbor's apartment because I'm wearing my virtual headset, you know? And so those are things that aren't really captured per se.
One point I wanted to make, and it was in the question and answers, is someone had a issue with the term each metaverse, and I thought it was well said. Some people think it's one metaverse, some think it's the next evolution of a metaverse, and it goes way back to the beginning of our conversation of, do you want to say each virtual world or each component of the the metaverse? But is the metaverse separate, a whole separate things put into one? Is it one? So even that alone, you can just dig in and have a hour panel probably on that conversation. And I think the duty is way more expansive. And if we had lots of time, I think you need to include civil liberties,
Yes,
about human rights, like it's almost like a chapeau, the term that you use for like keeping in mind that every new technology needs to keep in consideration a diverse set of views and human rights protections and et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's much more than, private or typical idea of privacy. It's a lot more, but we don't have to go into that.
Oh, no, because we are running out of time. And I want to make sure that we can like actually have something slightly coherent. And I also want to respond to some of these questions. Yes, thank you, Miranda, for realizing that this is a very challenging exercise, and I may have bit off more than I can chew, but it's fine. Okay, so as a like kind of recap, I think key terms to define are biometric information, biometric identifiers, because the information is basically what the company has translated with respect to the identifiers. And then who owns that information, right? Like the biometric identifiers are mine, but the information that you've made with respect to that, it's like, I feel like I should still own that information, but that's me. Metaverse, good points from the participants in terms of each metaverse, one particular universe, and realizing that you're going to have to think about interoperability aspects. I think then it's probably better to focus on the user experience, because I feel like that is something that will translate across all definitions, or at least whatever you would want to define this as. Like that's a clear thing. I have an experience in the whatever the metaverse is, in this virtual reality. But if you are going to do that, then you probably have to get into defining mixed reality, augmented reality, extended reality, because then you'd want to separate it maybe in terms of whether it's persistent, whether it like overlays with the physical world, whether it's a complete virtual world. And then that goes into the different expectations of privacy or the inferences made by the company. And that also affects the cybersecurity aspects. User interaction. I think personally, I feel like a user code of conduct is an easier thing to define. And that's actually a simple thing. Like you can just have a simple sentence of like, going back to the rights in terms of what kind of experience a consumer should have. If you lay out what the consumer's experiences should look like, then you can basically say that an operator of, because then you don't have to define who is the operator, but the operator of this virtual reality experience should then ensure that there's a code of conduct to enforce or to protect this, and to then talk about all privacy by design aspects. And so like you then therefore have to create a world that will live up to this. In terms of enforcement, I feel like that's better kicked to an agency. Which agency? Who knows? Whether you want to create an agency, whether you just want to like leave it up to the FTC, because they're the ones that essentially protect consumers based on what statements the company promises to the individual. That's easy, but like I feel like you might get into the FCC, because one thing that we didn't really mention here was like how this would affect accessibility and the digital divide and connectivity. And all of that has to do with like the FCC. And so then is this a framework that is going to be governed by multiple agencies? Is that something best done by one agency? I know, Hillary, you have had experience in terms of like shopping around stuff, like the idea of having something that's governed by multiple agencies. I don't know. I feel like that might not go over well with stakeholders. You're nodding yes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, each agency throughout there, you're going to get people born against it no matter what. So you're right. The more complicating it is, the more difficult it is. But you can put in things without it necessarily being an agency. Like you can put in something like in existing laws, like I know the NTIA, for example, is trying to give money for digital divide and digital access. Like you can put in something that says, any funds that go towards equipment that would be used to access, however you define metaverse, could fall under this fund or something, right? Like there are things you could do that don't necessarily mean that an agency is totally in charge. Like there are things you can say. That's where Bill goes from like 2 pages to like 100, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This definitely can easily be, I mean, I feel like this could be a 30-page bill if we're just sticking to like user experience. If we're going all in, this is a 100-page bill, right? There's so many cybersecurity things that you might want to talk about, like the data collection and privacy aspects, especially since we don't really have a privacy bill enacted, right? And so we would have to think about all of these things and the inferences made, and that's a whole nother can of worms. I'm interested to see how this will work its way out in courts, because whether this will affect the reasonable expectation of privacy. And I'm like, I put on a headset, and so therefore I know instinctively that they would have to map out my physical space, but am I really saying that like anyone can now have this data and do whatever they want with this? No, because no one's going to just come into my apartment and play, like, interact with me. So.
Yeah, Donalene, I think that also speaks to sort of a lot of how do we hold a lot of private actors accountable for things like that, right? With data brokers being an increasingly, I think, unregulated and sort of dangerous area that acts as, I think, in a lot of ways, like an exception to the Fourth Amendment protections that are, I think, weakening over time, right? It's like, well, if people are collecting information about, how you're physically, reacting to advertisements or a promotional object that's being dropped into your world or whatever it might be, can the information be sold to advertisers, to other companies, things like that, or to even law enforcement, right? If certain, political views are being expressed and you have a certain reaction to it, can that be sold to law enforcement or to intelligence agencies? Right now, there isn't any rule in place that says that, Meta can't sell that, right? And so I think that's another concern too.
Yes, yes, indeed. Okay, we are like at time, but do either of you have like any like closing thoughts? Like, how was this experience? This is my first time drafting like on the fly, so apologies, audience, if this was not as well done as I would have liked it to be.
I'm impressed. I think it was a lofty task, and I
Yeah, I think this was a really fun exercise. I think definitely lofty. I definitely agree with it. I think that's the right word for it, Hillary. I think like the topic itself is already so expansive and complicated. But I think it's been really, I think, exciting and fun to talk through it and hear sort of I think even though, I know Hillary, you said earlier, you're kind of like cautiously optimistic. I think I'm a little bit more critical or like concerned about certain things. But there's clearly a lot of overlap. And I think in the way that we think about, what the metaverse is, similar concerns. And, I think this has been a really fun exercise.
Okay.
and it's going to, Donalene, thank you. This will be memorialized. So when a bill does happen at some point, which could be 5-10 years, it could be, we can look back and say, we knew, you heard it here first, or it could be so different. And our conversation will be so basic, similar to like these conversations people had about the internet, 25, 30 years ago, right? It's just going to be interesting to have a actual memorialized document to look back at. So thank you.
Okay. One quick note, like on the legislative aspect. So I did look up whether we actually had some of these terms defined in law. So metaverse obviously is not defined. Mixed reality, augmented reality, extended reality. I didn't really see a definition for those, at least on the federal level. But then again, I was like quickly trying to get this program together. Biometric information and biometric identifier is actually defined. There's only one definition, and it's in, I guess because of TSA. So it's 49 USC 44903H, and so that defines biometric identifier information. There are a couple of bills in going through the motions right now. I think there's like 7 states that have introduced something, but I think there's probably like only 3 that actually have biometric information statutes. And so I think Illinois, I think Washington, and I think Colorado, don't quote me on that, folks. With respect to like identity theft laws, I think that's probably better on like that state level. I feel like that's a state issue. Fraud, I'm pretty sure we have regulations and also federal rules on this. We don't really have a privacy bill yet. There's one in the works, but who knows if that will actually get passed before this Congress ends. And I know we don't do anything on like biometric, bystander data. Reasonable expectation of privacy, that's usually just a court thing. Data collection, storage, and use. I feel like that depends on the sector, because we are a sector-based like legal framework. And so I feel like the health information, like privacy laws, those would probably be something that people would look at because of the biometric information and like the sensitivity of that data. Harassment, I don't think we have anything on that. Yeah, those are all of the things. Okay, thank you guys so much for this exercise. We have a few more events coming up in terms of the metaverse. We have our hackathon and we have our writing competition for those of you who are interested. And this will be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube and our podcast. And I just really want to thank Patrick and Hillary for a great conversation, and everyone who like submitted questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to address all of them. But yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for moderating and drafting, Donalene.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.